Dog. Written and read by Huw Carr. Directed by Brendan James. I was sitting in the cafeteria at uni when I fell completely and supernaturally in love with Sadie. Everything about her was reaching into me and gripping me, drawing me close to her. My body was made of my own heartbeat, which buzzed and trembled inside of me each time she laughed. That beautiful laugh. I did not know that there was something I could love as much as that laugh. We had met that day in a lecture. She had taken the only seat available next to me. She was rushed and a little flustered when she sat down, but all I could see was how stunningly beautiful she was. When she had begun to take notes and found her pen wasn't working, I smiled and lent her one of mine, tapping my dictaphone, which was recording the lecture, to reassure her as she raised her eyebrows at the offer. I retrieved another pen for a moment and began to take lazy notes. I had had this lecturer, Mr. Jacobs, before, and always found him mind-numbingly boring. In tutorials, he constantly forgot our names and had a habit of asking, "What do you think?" and then staring at us, expecting someone to know who he was asking. The problem was, he had a wall eye, so even if he was staring straight at you, you couldn't actually tell if he was looking at you. You had to average the distance between the two opposing directions his bulging eyes were pointing at, and take a guess as to whether it was you. I often found myself putting a finger to my chest and asking, "Me?" when he seemed to be looking at the side door and a space above my left ear simultaneously. So, in that lecture, as Sadie stopped scribbling notes and began to realize what Jacobs was droning on about wasn't worth recording, she turned to look at my notepad where I was sketching an unflattering picture of him at the lectern, with his goggly eyes rolling. I felt her seat shake as she laughed and continued to laugh, raising one white-fingered hand up to her beautiful mouth to hold in the giggles that were trying to burst out of her. To distract herself, I think, she leaned towards me and added to my picture, putting cat ears and whiskers on my parody of Jacobs, and somehow transforming him into something sad and beautiful. We continued to take turns adding to the sketch. Each moment she was moving closer until her arms touched. Neither of us pulled away. After the lecture, we walked along side by side. We both had places to go, but we didn't want to break the connection that had formed. For me, I think I was mostly play-acting and being cocky and charming. She was a few years older than me and full of the confidence of her beauty. She had long, richly black hair that swept around her face and large blue eyes that seemed radiant pools. I had often heard of eyes like pools, and looking at hers, I finally understood what it meant. You could stare and stare and stare at them and never get enough. As I was staring, she blushed beautifully and giggled that laugh that made me want to seize her and hold her to me. Being away from that laugh suddenly felt like the deepest fear I could ever know. Oh, how little I knew what fear was back then on that day. She had to go to a tutorial, and I had to finish an assignment before the close of the office. I did something I have never done before. I asked if we could meet after, and she, so sweetly and shyly, smiled her big smile and said she'd love that. Love that. Oh, God. Those words. If I had died then in that moment, my life would have been perfect. I wouldn't have known what I came to know, and I wouldn't have done what I have done. As she walked away, I hurt inside. Her presence filled me with a spontaneous joy that I don't remember feeling before. This wasn't a summer camp girlfriend or the fumbling collection of awkward disasters that was my end of high school romance. This was a serious adult thing, a burning thing, an animal thing, a thing that bit me hard and deeply. My assignment flowed out of me in the library. It had been stillborn inside of me up to that point, and I couldn't find the strength to rip it out. The all too brief time with Sadie, with the promise of more to come, had lit something inside. I fired the words out onto the page and was swept up by my own cleverness that I was fashioning the best thing I had ever written on only the fumes of the fragrance of her hair. Then, after I had submitted the assignment into the office minutes before closing, I turned to the cafeteria where we had decided to meet. For half an hour past our proposed meeting time, I waited, twisting in agony inside that she had come to her senses and realized she had made a pointless promise to a boy she didn't know and didn't have to. Waiting there, I felt like a boy. She was a woman. Why would a woman be with a boy? A tearing ache ripped, as if a cord inside me was slicing me apart. She wouldn't come. I would sit there, growing cold and empty and forever broken with an unknown longing. She came. I saw her half running across the quad lawn, looking about as she ran. She was slender and doe-like, her dark hair flowing around her bare arms long and moon-white pale. Her face was anxious as she scanned the tables, and then, oh, joy, I saw her see me, and her face broke into a smile. That was the moment I fell in love. Sitting with me at the table, we ignored everything and drank each other in. She leaned over the smooth tabletop, her hair sweeping the surface and swaying, tantalizingly covering and then revealing the dark, plunging point of her cleavage, and her breasts rising in a swell with a shaky breath. Around us, our fellow students were loudly condemning the news of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and in their righteous anger they devised exquisitely cruel punishments for the perpetrators. All I could think of was the milk of her skin, how the cloud soft flesh at the top of her breasts moved, and how she seemed to thrill at the sight of me licking her up in my mind's eye. We were both hungry. Sadie said her home wasn't far. "Come to my place," she said. Her car that we both slid into was the first sign to me that she didn't know much about my world. It was a BMW E30 325i convertible, as black as her hair. It must have cost as much as my entire HEX fee for my degree, and more. We drove from the uni to Torquay, where she had a flat of her own. I am renting this tiny, ugly granny flat at the back of a house that smells eternally of old people and cabbage, and only just getting by on my waiter's wage, and she had a flat all of her own, open and sunny, and looking down on the beach and sea cliffs. She got out of the car first. In her shorts, the saddle of her thighs bulged out in a perfect curve. The line of her buttocks was clearly drawn as she walked with a swing of her hips to the door, urging me to follow. She kicked off her canvas shoes at the door and walked barefooted over cool tiles that mirrored the pastel sky, milky with sea spray. My hunger grew so that I felt my blood inside of me. Every step I took rubbed my jeans against restricted flesh. We sat on her balcony. She stretched out her long legs. The softness of her calves caught my eyes. My gaze thundered along the stretch from her calf to her heels as she planted pretty feet on the coffee table, her toes often brushing my shin. We could both tell we were famished. That afternoon was like a hunt, but the lamb and the wolf played with each other every step, and I never knew which of us was which. Our laughter made us rise up and pace about her place, me ever close to her. Fingers touched each other's. She smiled fully and held mine. A silly chasing game full of laughter and little screams of delight from her led, bit by bit, into her bedroom. We fell on the bed. Touching became kissing, kissing that went on and on. I was content with that alone. Her mouth was making me tremble with each gasp that her lips ate on mine. Her tongue was lapping in my mouth. She took my hand and led it under her top. My heart gaped inside and felt open. I found I had no more control other than giving in to the hunger. I seized her breast, bare beneath the dark tank top. Clothes were fast falling free. It never even entered my mind that I barely knew her, and that she would be the first to have my flesh inside of her. Her legs wrapped around me. My body was guided into hers as if it was a path I always knew. Although I was shipwrecked by my senses, I had never known that the greater joy was in hearing and feeling her lost in hers. My darkness was in her light skin. When I was at last overcome and shuddered a final thrust, she hugged her legs tighter and held me there. For what seemed like an hour we lay and listened to nothing but each other's drawing in of breath, our exhausted laughter. She held me inside of her and did not let go. The afternoon became an evening, and we were not sated. Each time I made love to her through that night, I fell in deeper. I took her, and the lines of her body were engraved in my mind. Gripping her hips, I looked down over the sloping valley of her back to her cascading hair over her pillow. I should not have done it. I know I should not have done it. But from my mouth slipped words that were true to me as they tumbled out. God, I love you. I still wanted more when she fell asleep beside me. In the morning, we were both reignited. Slick with our own sweat, we stood naked in her kitchenette and played at cooking, food wasted as we bit at each other more than the sacrificed portions. I told her that she was my first. I had never known anything like this. I rambled and did not then notice how her laughter did not fall so freely as before. We showered separately. I wanted to have her again with her skin mermaid wet, tickled by rivulets of water snakes that rippled over her belly, her nipples like carns on a rained mountaintop. But she was suddenly body shy, shunning me until she was done. A pang struck me as I washed myself alone in her shower, wanting her. When I dried and emerged, she was fully dressed. With excuses of study and assignments to do, she motioned me to collect my clothes and dress. Her laughter had stopped. Without her laughter, the room seemed cold and strange. How I tried to recapture whatever mercurial thing it was that yesterday had made every word I said and every movement I made make her cling to me and summon up the man by her side with her laughter. Did I do something? I asked stupidly. She shook that long black hair, showering me again with its living perfume, and smiled a sympathetic smile. No, you were wonderful. I just really need to get on with my assignment. I am late. I have 2 extensions and I have to finish them. All the way through the drive back to my slovenly temporary home, I couldn't feel the sun on me. I felt my body was falling out through my back, and bit by bit it was being left behind on the road back to her bed. We barely spoke. I got her to drop me off at the corner of my street. The houses on the corner looked more respectable with their rose bushes and well-painted fences than the ugly brick veneer building I lived at the back of. I sat on my narrow single bed, trying to feel something. At last, I did. I could not feel myself. I was numb, but I could feel something outside. Among the pittosporums and camellias that half hid the granny flat in the yard, I could feel something circling. The sliding door before me that led to the flat's porch was open. Whatever it was, as it paced back and forth, it kept itself out of sight. A dog? No. I had closed the cyclone gate and heard it clang shut behind me as I had thrust it away from me with a frozen feeling of wanting to understand what had happened. There was no dog in the yard. It was something heavier. Something that I did not want to rise off my bed and see. I sat there as the day fell away, unmoving, listening and hearing nothing, yet all the time feeling the frightening weight of the pacing thing. The next day, I cycled to uni with no other desire than to see Sadie. I missed both my morning tutorials as I sat in the cafeteria waiting to see her. The day went agonizingly slow, delivering a sickening blow when she didn't appear and relight the day that had become grey, cloudy and dark. Periodically I went by the uni gym, the student bookshop, the student lounge, the library. I visited the car parks to find sign of her car. I even wandered aimlessly around the grounds, aching and turning each corner into the place where she would walk suddenly into my sight and light up, laughing. Riding home, when I reached my street, I dismounted and walked the bike to the gate. All along that way, I felt something following me, hiding behind fences in the gardens to stay out of sight. I paused at the gate and stared behind, though I could feel it and was sure it knew that I could sense its closeness. It did not emerge. It stayed hidden, waiting for me to slip inside my dingy little flat. I could not sleep that night. I did not sleep at all. Now the thing seemed to be deliberately brushing against the walls as it paced around. It was clever. It never did so to make a definite sound for me to hear. I only felt the walls shiver from the inside as it pressed against them and passed. I was sure now that it was not a dog. It felt as heavy as a horse, yet it felt too like it was low to the ground, almost panther-like. Though in its blunt-headed movements, I felt it had more of the gait of a wide lizard. As a little child, my favourite book had been one detailing the monsters and ghosts of Britain. One page still struck me, returning in dreams when I was sick or confused. Black Shuck, a great, black, shaggy hound, the size of a calf, leaping across the dark moors, and in its horrible, huge head, one great eye, the size of a saucer. To see Black Shuck was to know your final doom was upon you. He was the wild agent of death. If something like Black Shuck was out there, it was pacing and ploughing a trench as it circled. It was making a pit for me to fall into if I ventured outside. But I didn't care. That monster was nothing compared to the thing that was eating me from the inside out. I needed to see Sadie's face. I needed to hear her laugh. I wanted her naked skin. I wanted her taste. As I sat alone and ached for her, I heard the beast beyond growl, low and hungry. The morning came, pale and sickly hued. I knew that the beast had slipped away and left me. Now that I felt it had grown, I think it needed the night. Still, I could sense that it was near. There were empty houses nearby where it could hide. On the porch, I found it had expertly and silently filled in the trench it had made. I crossed over the hidden ring it had formed and snatched up my bike again. I had not noticed then that I hadn't eaten the previous day, and felt no need that morning either. I was shaky as I cycled to uni. As I dipped down into the hill, gathering speed for the painful climb up the other side, I almost became unbalanced and only just managed to save myself from pitching towards an overtaking car. The driver seemed to pass close by, as if seeking to show me he had the right to clip me and send me sprawling into the scrubland by the roadside. I hardly cared. Yet he suddenly swerved away and gave me a wide berth. Grimly, I grinned to myself as I watched him. I was sure he had spotted that in between the twisting gorse and banksias in the gully at the valley's base, a dark shape, equal in size to his car, was keeping pace with me. I saw no sign of the beast as I climbed the bare side of the hill. It would be waiting, I was sure, in the thick trees that surrounded the uni. This is the day that it truly began. It was in this hour. All hope and want and yearning to see another day and the joy of a new morning can bring ended. Knowing that I did not have a lecture until 3 and no other classes that day, I got to the campus early to spend some time looking for Sadie. She wasn't in any of the regular student hangouts by the fountain court or on the walking track that made a hemisphere around the bird sanctuaries and the management center, so I headed to the library. When I walked in, I could swear that I could smell her hair. My excitement rose as I patrolled the study tables and rows of books until, at last, I found her. I wanted to plant a kiss on her cheek, but she smiled, and the space between us remained unbroken. She looked tired, but I could barely see properly with the lightness of heart that was enveloping me again. Wherever the beast had been lurking, I felt ready to send it packing, despite the size it had swollen to. "I've missed you," I managed to say. At first she said nothing. She smiled in a half-hearted way and looked down at the books she was holding close to her chest. When she looked up, I could see that her eyes were red. There were dark rings beneath her eyes, and her face looked both worried and uncertain. I really don't know how to say this. I've been worried about how to say it. Something has happened. I really can't be with anyone right now. I don't understand, I said weakly. From far below the room, I felt a heavy shape move. Something rumbled. At the time, I weakly wondered if it was thunder. Now, with what has happened, I am sure it was not. "I think I would like to be friends with you. But friends, you're wonderful, but things have suddenly changed for me and I can't be with you. I'm sorry." My tongue was thick in my mouth. I tried to understand, to discover where I'd gone wrong. Each thing I said or asked made me feel I was pushing myself further from her. When I realized all she was saying in reply was, "I'm sorry," I had enough sense to smile, back away, and mumble something to show I was not as I truly was, dead inside. Outside and surrounded by students, I felt alone. Each one was walking with a purpose, mostly in 2s or 3s. They seemed secure and complete. I stumbled away from the crowded places, walking on, just walking with no direction in mind, no purpose other than it was better than standing and feeling like I was slowly turning into stone. With the murmur of voices behind me, I headed away from the buildings and towards the trees that formed the outer perimeter of the campus land. Through them, I entered open paddock and walked on. Each step was as mechanical and meaningless as the last. I crossed an empty field and on into another one, until the ground about me began to slope down, following a dried-out creek bed. I meandered this way, covering 2 miles, before I met with a line of trees that formed the back of a private property. Without thinking, I turned at the end and changed direction until I met a road, dusty and deserted. Here, I sank down by the roadside and sat staring at it. In the hours that I sat there, unmoving, perhaps 2 or 3 cars passed me by. Looking back, I recall that they slowed down. Perhaps the driver or passenger of 1 or 2 were curious as to why I was sitting there, staring blankly ahead and not moving. Somewhere inside of me, a fantasy grew of one car racing along that empty road so quickly that I could rise up and step out into its path, smashing myself to pieces. That didn't happen. I half wish now that it had. Finally, the knowledge that I had an evening shift filtered through to my brain. I snapped to when I realized my misery had carried me somewhere I had never been. It was well into the late afternoon before I retraced my route back to my bike, and at last got home, barely with enough time to shower quickly and change into my work clothes. Arriving at the restaurant I waited at only moments before my shift started, I avoided the other employees and lost myself in learning the evening specials and working my section of the restaurant floor. Although I had often worked a long shift after an equally long schooling day and felt tired halfway through, when it occurred to me that I had passed another day without eating, the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. At first, I was unknowingly grateful for this. My hunger and tiredness were distracting me from the desire for Sadie's laugh. Hearing that would be worth all of this. And then I did. The jangling bell of the restaurant door opening sounded, its familiarity suddenly quietened by the very sound I had wanted to hear. My head jerked towards the sound. From the back of the restaurant where I served, over the open middle section and so to the reception at the front, I could look and saw her at once. She was smiling brightly, in the same way I had seen her smile across the cafeteria. Yet the rising ecstasy was replaced with a wrenching despair as I saw, standing beside her, a handsome man, tall and suave and so well suited to be beside her. Gone was her jean shorts and tank top. Instead, she stood in a cocktail dress and black stockings, her lips cherry red, and her hair even more beautiful. Adorned, no doubt, for the taste of the man beside her, a man whose face only smiled lightly, that he had one arm confidently around her waist. My gut clenched. Something seemed to be churning inside me. As my hand came to my mouth to hold back the sudden surge of vomit that burned up my throat, I left behind the table I stood at to serve, and the startled faces of the well-dressed couple who were looking at me with open wine menu and shocked surprise. I pushed through the serving station. I heard a falling plate crash and a shout following it. Through the serving kitchen and the back door I staggered until, in the staff car park, I released a spray of burning, sulphurous sick. From among the skips and assorted detritus that had collected there, I heard again a low, angry rumble. Someone was calling my name through the kitchen. I ran away from the back door before I was discovered, stained and disgraced, out into the back streets. Just before I heard the screen door slap open, I heard the heavy skip shift and scrape a few feet along the asphalt, and then the sound of a large thud. It was the sound of something heavy leaping up and coming back to the ground again. Coughing with the filth in my mouth, I broke out into a run. Turning corners, I sought out side streets that were narrow, where only I could fit. True to my rising fear, I heard the unmistakable scrambling of huge claws carving at the road. My voice caught in my throat. I saw at last my one chance, a gap between two buildings that was only barely wide enough for me to squeeze through into a closed-off space beyond. I sprinted for it, and even as I struck myself into it, crying out as my flesh scraped against the brick, and I felt a hot, flowing blood, I saw it. I saw it. Around a corner it came, following the way I had come. It was neither dog nor panther nor impossible lizard. What I saw, as I clamoured with all my strength to thrust myself through the gap, was a long, horribly monstrous shape, black and writhing, something like hair, or maybe not, maybe smoke, or 1,000 twitching feelers covered it from head to haunches. Either my fear or its motion blurred it in my sight. I screamed. My throat bleated out a strangled sound as I saw it lunging towards me. The only shape clear against its blackness were wicked, iron-like teeth in a mouth open that howled madly. Pain tore across my head, and I was falling. I hit the road hard on the far side of the gap. The small gated backyard I found myself in had high corrugated iron walls, but it could leap its way over them, I was sure. Not caring who found me, I ran for the back door in the building I saw across the far side of the yard. My hands fell on the handle. The door opened, and I threw myself into a dark and narrow corridor. The door snicked shut behind me with a sheltering clang of steel. As the blood bubbled over my head, I listened for the sound of its searching. Time passed. The sky outside, only visible through a small scratch in a black-washed window, turned dark. How long could it wait? Unable to make its way into the building, was the creature intelligent enough to lurk outside, only to hunt me down when I ventured onto the street again? The fear of being ripped apart by the teeth I had seen washed away my previous emptiness. When Sadie had rejected me, it had felt like life was over. Now with this hungry thing outside, with its dreamlike ability to always find me, I longed to live. Slowly, my mind started to clear. I made my way through unlit corridors to the office front of the building. It was empty, yet at the service desk at the front I found a phone and dialed a taxi. I stayed inside until it arrived, only then unlocking the door at the front and quickly gaining the seat beside the driver. There was no sign of the creature as we set out towards my home. For a moment, I thought of returning to the restaurant to collect my bike, but that is where it had been waiting for me before. I did not feel like pushing my luck. Out onto Murrable Street, we passed a pub on the corner. Beneath the sulphurous glow of the streetlight, a small woman half crouched, while a large, beer-sodden man in his late 20s towered over her, trapping her between him and the wall. I asked the driver to stop, and we pulled up as I wound down the window and called to the woman. "Are you all right?" Hearing my voice, the man stumbled back from the wall and released her, turning to me and walking in an uncertain way towards the taxi. He reached out to steady himself and gripped at the handle of the taxi door. "What's it to you?" he barked, tugging on the locked handle. "It's none of your fucking business." I wound up the window enough that he couldn't thrust his hand in, but I could still call out. Again, I tried to gain the woman's attention. Although she was still cowering, she looked blearily over. "None of your business," she echoed the man. I stared at her. The dress that had started the night off immaculately, chosen with care to match her earrings and shoes, now looked like it had been roughly hitched up her thighs. The man tottered backwards, unbalanced, then turned to resume the imprisoning stance he had made before. "It's nothing to do with us," the taxi driver said. No one but me, it seemed, could see the future for these two. Perhaps their own black beasts were nearby, but the man's monstrous counterpart was already disemboweling her weak and willowy one in some forgotten side alley. Even before I shook my head, knowing there was nothing I could do, the car was driving on. What if it had been Sadie? I wondered then if I would have done something, if it had been her, beleaguered by the polished man who had stolen her, no, who she had flung herself upon. "I can't be with you," she had said. "I can't be with you." She can't told me she couldn't be with anyone. It was me she couldn't be with. Why? Hadn't I felt her clasping me in bliss? Hadn't her cries been more real than any truth? I looked back on that night. There was not one moment when I hadn't felt her hunger, and how much she gazed at me after each splash our bodies mixed, and made us only want to look into each other's eyes. Hadn't that been real? I could still half feel her legs holding me into her, as if she would always want me to be so. What happened to always in the space of only one night? The taxi pulled up into the darkness about my home. For one frightened moment, as I stepped out of the protection of the car's shell, I looked into the shadows beneath the overhanging oak and plane trees where the granny flat lay, and wondered if it was waiting. I had to get the money for the fare from the house, so I stepped towards the blackness. If it leapt out now and tore off my head, at least there would be a witness. Maybe Sadie would hear of it and come to weep at my funeral. Nothing assailed me as I walked through the blackness and returned with the fare. Was it possible that by some unlikely means we had lost it? For a brief moment I imagined it following our trail and finding the drunk man outside the pub instead. Somehow that brought me comfort that it was out there. Unfortunately, the unexpected fare for the taxi had eaten up the last of my money. There was none left for food for me. Besides, it was too late in the evening. In my quiet and mostly elderly settled neighborhood, the local milk bar was closed by 7. Sitting in the dark, I waited before attempting to sleep. Sure enough, I heard what I expected would come. Soft and almost cat-like, the great, heavy body fell on all fours into the yard, and then made no other movement. For 10 minutes at least, I sat stock still, without moving, hardly daring to breathe. Over the hammer-like thud of my own heart, I heard it. From seemingly high up, close to the height of the gutter of the roof, came a low, rumbled breath. It expelled from the monstrous head in a way that reminded me of a great cat. In the alley, I had seen how large it was. Surely it could break the thin walls of my flat open. What was it waiting for? More minutes passed by. The more time that passed, the more the fear of being destroyed by this thing became less with the agony of waiting. Was this what the injured bird felt as the cat watched and played with it, waiting for a moment where it was satisfied that only the crunch of its neck could be better than the game of toying with its terror? At last, I could take no more. I reached out blindly and fumbled for the torch on my desk, seized it and switched it on. The door stood out stark and grey. The deep breath from beyond the door continued with a steady, unchanged, grumbling purr. With stiff limbs, I raised the torch. Sitting upright, greater than the stone lions on the steps of the town hall, greater than any living beast I have ever seen, the creature sat, still as I. In the torchlight, I could see that the blackness and iron grey of its exposed teeth had been joined by another colour. The whole front of the grinning, bestial head was pasted with vermilion. From the teeth hung shreds of dripping red that I knew, even as I shied away, had come from a living man or woman who had only just now met its end. In horror, I collapsed back. I fell against my bed and then scrambled over it, seeking a shelter against the back wall that I knew would never stop the beast. I hugged my arms around myself, drawing up into a ball. I rocked and cried a hopeless wail, weak and almost voiceless. "Go away," I pleaded pathetically. "Go away." And to my surprise, it did just that. As cat-like as it had come, it leapt away into the dark and did not return that night. That was last night. I slept through until about 10 in the morning. When I woke, I checked outside for signs of the creature and the gruesome remnants of its feast. I found none. My landlady, Joyce, had come back in the morning after a fortnight away at her sister's. I came in the back to the sound of the talkback radio she listened to every morning. What I heard made me run to the television to await the midday news. Early this morning, street cleaners had found a ghastly discovery in the side lanes off Muralong Road. A viciously brutalized corpse of a man, his internal organs shredded and spread about the lane in a way, as the newscaster said with dramatically stoic expression, that investigating officers claimed surpassed the cruelty of Jack the Ripper. The body has been identified through personal effects as... But I did not hear the name. I only saw the face. It was grinning and handsome, and so unlike the drunken thug I had seen through the taxi window last night. But there was no mistaking it. So, my black shuck had come to show me its handiwork. It had been more hungry than I am. It had a whole sleepy backwater of a town to choose from, and it chose the one man who I'd wanted to see destroyed. It had torn him apart and seemingly not left a paw print or any other identification that it was anything more terrifying than a madman. And it had done it for me. Rubbing my chin, I began to think of all the bullies, abusers, and fattened, entitled ingrates that snatched away happiness and hope from the humble, the downtrodden, and the lost, the loveless, the ones who had no hope for love. Was I wrong to hope that someone as beautiful, so full of life as Sadie could be happy with me? I had no hope now of filling her life with cars and houses by the sea, skiing trips in Switzerland where we could lock ourselves away in a cabin in the snow and care about nothing else but how we could live on a diet of love alone. I can love so much that I would do anything for her. I could live on the song of that laugh. I could drink the darkness of her hair, and if any darkness threatened her, I could bring my own dark beast against anything. The polished man, who I knew saw her beauty as an accessory for his own soulless self-love. I could save her. Couldn't she see that I would want to save her from me? She had looked at me and looked at him, and she had chosen soulless over love broken. Would I be saving her? Would I be saving myself? The beast took what it wanted and justly ate that which deserves to be its diet. It did not come to devour me. It came to show me instead what its wildness could do, what my wildness could do. As it was walking with me, should I now learn to walk with it? This thought possessed me all the day. Left to my own actions, I could take a goddess's gift and smear it with my naivete, my refusal to accept the beast within. The bold, and I must say now, somehow beautiful beast, so like the surety of a lion, so faithful to me, like a dog. Black Shuck, in my childhood book, had never left me, and scared as I claimed to be by his image, I had never thrown that book away. I had always taken it out time and again to stare at him, all the time unaware that he had never meant to devour me. Before the evening came, I made my way back to work. I apologized for leaving without notice, confidently turning what had yesterday been a shame-filled edit into the story of sudden sickness. Something bad I ate. I took my weekly pay. I called a taxi. I enjoyed the ride out to Torquay. I spent the evening relaxing on the dunes within sight of Sadie's house. Her car had been absent from the drive all day. I pawed at the sand with my feet. My hunger was aching now. After this, I would eat. And with that thought, I felt my beast. As the sun died behind the dunes, its redness turned the beach into a sympathetic hue. I and my beast waited until the darkness came. I listened to the slow, rumbled breathing. It pawed the sand as I had done. Where before I had felt its size through the walls, now so close at hand, I felt nothing but its hunger. It had to eat tonight. I know, I said in response to the thundering rumble within it. I marveled as we waited how our joint breath had fallen into rhythm so soon, so new to each other's needs, and so able to read and know. As the last color left the horizon, a dim band of pale emerald and topaz turning to gray, then black, the twin lights I had been waiting for crested the rise in the road and swept towards Sadie's home. The car's top was down. Her hair was free and streaming, and she was alone. She pulled into her drive and very slowly rose up out of her car and made her way to the door. When her door closed, my beast rose, and I did too. Its breath was cold against my neck. She was alone? I had not expected that. I had thought, but there, more lights followed. Another car, even more exclusive than her own, swung into place beside hers. The man was swifter out than her and reached the front door in a hurried, jerky manner. He did not ring her bell. Instead, he knocked on the door, long and loudly. The beast and I stopped. We waited. He had to hammer again. She did not open. With hands clenched and flailing spasmodically, he left the door and marched around the house. For a moment I saw him as he rose, clambering up onto her balcony. The beast broke from me. With 3 or 4 leaping strides, it crossed the road and disappeared among the tall shrubs and saltbush beneath the balcony. As I ran behind it, I heard its undisguised grunts and the champing of its mouth. I could hear the slavering wetness and bubbling beneath its teeth. Its meal was too close at hand, and it was giving its head to the frenzy of the feast to come. When I reached the balcony, I found I mounted it more gracefully than the soon-to-be meal had done. I kept out of the dim light that came from within and slipped onto the wood where we had sat only days before. In the window, I saw her dark hair disappearing out of view. Then I heard the front door slam. Was there someone else? As quickly as I had come, I stole back towards the front. Even before I saw him, I heard him cursing, spitting out disgusting names. Names he was branding her with. Good. Good. Die now with those words on your lips. No sound behind me. I looked back for my beast. Now! I hissed into the dark place I thought it was crouching, waiting. He'll go! Get him now! The engine sounded, and before I could think what to do, he was pulling out into the street. Could it go after the car? Could it rip him out and destroy him? He was getting away. No! I cried out impotently. Nothing stalked out from the dark. Nothing stopped him from disappearing down the street. I fell to my knees and hammered the ground in fury. Why not now? Why not now? The rumbling from out of the dark startled me. It came at the same time I heard the balcony door open. Sadie came out and stood, looking to the sea and clutching herself. The unmistakable sound of heartbreak shuddering her breath. I stared up at her. Her face was etched with sorrow. However much I had loved her for her beauty, I had found something now that could strike me more. I looked on her as she hugged herself, and I felt my own tears. How could I hate? I had hated that man outside the pub in an instant, and that hate had been picked up, it seemed, by the beast. My hate had destroyed him. My hate had destroyed him. Then I heard the rumble again. My beast was there, head raised and straining, its vision locked on the one thing that I could never see destroyed. I clawed my way to its side. I mouthed out the words, "Not Sadie." No. Perhaps to her, that rumble had seemed the threat of a storm. Quickly she turned and took herself inside. My beast paced back and forth, impatient with the need that I could feel inside it. Did I hate her? If I had in some small way protected myself through hate, then the sight of her face, suffering exactly what I had suffered, had washed me clean of it. I don't hate her. I hissed to the beast. It ignored me. I could tell, like any wild thing, that the burning hunger inside of it was all it felt. The house would be no hindrance. It could burst in through the windows, and this time I would have to face the destruction I had brought. So now, in this moment, now I know. I know. This vision of her is the last. I have seen Sadie for the last time. I am turning my head now and looking at my beast. "You're hungry," I say, my voice shaking. I'm afraid. I just wish I had better understood before now. "You're hungry," I say again, backing away, and this time my beast is coming out of the shadows and stepping closer. I wish you'd let me see her one last time. But you need your meal, don't you? One last meal. I can give it. You don't need to take it from anyone else. We are walking back now, over the road and back to the shadows beneath the sea cliff. The sound of the rumble is equal with the wind. So I'm closing my eyes. I'm picturing Sadie lying on her bed, her large eyes looking at me with love, looking at me hungrily with love. And with that, my hunger, my love ends. This edition of the Black Dog Chronicles is now available on Bandcamp. You can be the first to own this story and more. Please support our channel by purchasing a copy and telling your friends. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Press the notification bell to be up to date with every new story. And as always, look out for the monsters.